Of course, this is like the perfect time to talk about the history of the Labour Party, because Corbyn's election is like an historic event. It's one of the events that I'm sure future generations will regard as one of the real milestones in the history of the Labour Party. So it's a great opportunity to think about the history of the Labour Party, and I think a great opportunity to think about what can history tell us about where's Labour going to go. So of course, the $1 million question is, what can Corbyn actually do with the Labour Party? So I'll give an outline of the history of the Labour Party. Maybe that might help us answer some questions about, can Corbyn do anything with the Labour Party? And I'll try and sort of raise some themes. And I think one of the themes that I often come across is that there was a golden age of the Labour Party. It's interesting. You talked about you left when Blair became leader, and for a lot of people, when Blair became leader, the party shifted too far to the right, and that was the end of its commitment to socialism. I think if you look at the history of the Labour Party, you'll actually find that its commitment to socialism has never been strong. Now, going back to the origins of the Labour Party, the Labour Party was actually formed in 1900. There was a group called the Labour Representation Committee. That's what it was called originally. Now, the choice of name is interesting in itself, because, of course, what's not in that title is socialism. There's nothing about socialism in the name of the original Labour Party. Now, it's founded in 1900. But if you go back a bit further into the 19th century, the Labour Party is founded on the idea that the British working class are peaceful, they like reforms, we love the Queen. The idea of being too militant, being too revolutionary, that's not the British way. That's always been part of Labour Party thinking. But if you look at the history of the English working class in the 19th century, it's a history of violence. Of course, we're in the city of the Peterloo Massacre. You've got the Chartist insurrection in the 1840s. You've got Luddite rebellions, across northern England in the 1840s. So the history of the English working class is actually a history of rebellion and confrontation. And then in the 1880s, you get another sort of wave of militancy called New Unionism. And this was really the organisation of low-skill workers, part-time workers, women workers, a huge upsurge of class struggle. But around about the 1890s, that struggle is defeated. And it's really the Labour Party is born out of that defeat. So the Labour Party is not born out of a sort of rising tide of class struggle. It's the opposite. The Labour Party is born out of defeat. Because workers in the 19th century, workers think they can do things themselves. But after they've had this defeat in the 1890s, they look for others to look after them. They look to change from above, particularly from the trade unions. So the LRC is founded in 1900. Now again, the name of it is interesting, because it's not about socialism, but it's all about how can we, the unions, represent the interests of the workers. How can we do it for them? So it's not about self-activity of workers. It's all about leave it to us. We're the trade unions. You don't need to do anything. You sit back. You vote for us, and everything will be okay. The other thing that leads to the formation of the Labour Party is that there's a sort of court case. It's roughly the same time called the Taft Vale Judgment. Now, the Taft Vale Judgment is interesting because it's almost the same as what the Tories are bringing in now. Huge restrictions on what trade unions can do in terms of pickets, in terms of ballots, in terms of being unions having to compensate for industrial action. So we're actually almost literally back to square one in terms of trade unions. So the Labour Party is also formed out of an attempt to campaign against the Taft Vale Judgment. Now, in its early years, there's two major parties in Britain, not the Labour Party, but the Liberals and the Conservatives. And for the early years of the history of the Labour Party, they just see themselves as tagging along the Liberals. They just see themselves as, let's give the Liberals a push. There's actually a sort of, an electoral non-aggression pact. Liberals and Labour won't stand against each other. So very, very sort of modest demands in the early history of the Labour Party. And now that all changes in World War I. World War I changes everything. And of course, World War I, from the viewpoint of the working class, it's a huge rebellion right across Europe. Above all, a Russian Revolution, but also huge revolutionary upsurges in Germany, Italy, France, and even in the UK itself, you get where there's Red Clydeside. There's a real radicalisation right across Europe, and the Labour Party taps into that. Now, one of the most famous, one of the most famous things that Blair did was get rid of Clause 4, this sort of commitment to nationalisation. Now, that only came in 1918. So, original Labour Party wasn't committed to nationalisation, much more modest demands. But because of this rebellion, working class rebellion across Europe in the World War I, that's when they put in the bit about nationalisation. Now, one of the early Labour leaders, a guy called Henderson, he made a very interesting observation about this. He said, well, we'll put in clause 4 because it will restore the faith of the workers in Parliament. You know, almost explicitly saying that, you know, the British system, the British capitalism is under threat. We need to do something quick. So that's a way of restoring the credibility of Parliament. Now, you know, post World War I, you get a huge upsurge, I said, in like militancy. You know, the trade unions in the UK sort of double in size. You know, from up to about 8 million, and it's out of that sort of post World War I upsurge that you get the first Labour government. First Labour government is a minority government, in other words, it doesn't have a sort of working majority, led by Ramsay MacDonald. Now, this government doesn't last very long. It lasts less than a year. And in fact, the most interesting thing about this government is really how it fell, because it falls because of it's an event known as the Ledwith letter. Now, the Ledwith letter was when the Daily Mail posted this fabricated forged letter that was allegedly from the Russians, saying that, you know, we order our Communist Party to rise up and help the Labour Party undermine British capitalism. The thing about that is, you know, what it shows you is that, you know, the institutions of the British state have not changed at all. The Daily Mail was a filthy rag then, as it remains today. Now that government doesn't last very long, brought down. 2 years later, you get the general strike. Now, the general strike, you might think, well, surely the general strike is the sort of thing the Labour Party will be really into. The Labour Party play a big role in like organising the general strike. But the opposite, Labour Party plays no role in terms of organising it, in terms of mobilising for it, in terms of propaganda for it. And in fact, you know, the Tory government that defeats the general strike is able to use emergency powers legislation that were brought in by that Labour government 2 years earlier. Now, Labour gets back in 1929, same Prime Minister, Ramsay MacDonald. But unfortunately, from the viewpoint of that government, that's the year of the Wall Street crash, the Great Depression. Now, of course, you've got a Labour government in a Great Depression, you know, an age of austerity. It's got a choice. It either spends money, classic sort of social democratic political economy, let's spend our way out of this recession sort of approach of the centre left, or it's got let's impose austerity. Now, you know, again, when we look into future Labour governments, the option in that situation is always impose austerity. So what Ramsay MacDonald does is he imposes like 20% cuts right across the board, cuts unemployment benefit by 20%, cuts public spending, and then most notoriously treacherous of all, he actually joins the Conservatives in what's called the national government. So now this creates a huge split in the Labour Party. Again, the other sort of theme I'll try and talk about is the arguments between left and right in the Labour Party. Now, of course, we're seeing this today, with Corbyn's sort of battles with his own party. There's nothing new there. This goes right back to to the 1920s. But what you find with this struggle between left and right in the Labour Party is the right always wins. The left has its sort of upward movements and sometimes wins control of the party, but it always loses. So when MacDonald forms this coalition government, that splits the Labour Party massively. Demoralised, it really struggles to recover, and of course you've got the Great Depression in the 1930s, so workers aren't really in the mood for activity. But the Labour Party recovered. Now again, what's interesting is that it's often the left that helps the Labour Party recover, restore its credibility. So in the mid-30s, you get a group within the Labour Party called the Socialist League, led by people like, become very famous later on, people like Clement Attlee, and Irene Bevan, Stafford Cripps. And it's the left of the Labour Party that helps it regain its credibility. Remember, in the 1930s, the Communist Party is active and strong in the UK. So there is a rival for the Labour Party, and it's really the Socialist League, the left of the Labour Party, helps it restore its credibility. By the time now getting into World War II, by this time Clement Attlee, who's the best known leader of the Socialist League, he becomes Deputy Prime Minister for Churchill, and it's really in this time that that Labour starts to establish itself as a credible party, in terms of the ruling class. Because of course, the first Labour governments in the 1920s, you get Red Scares, things like Zinoviev letter, lots of fear about what a Labour government means. But by the time, because Attlee serves as Deputy Prime Minister, that establishes Labour as, this is a party of the establishment, this is a party where capitalism is safe. Now, when I talked about the golden age of Labour, after World War II, for most people, that's the golden age government, Attlee's government, 45 to 51. And there's no doubt that, compared to governments that come afterwards, it does look like a sort of, as close as you might expect to get to a socialist utopia in the UK for most people looking back. Of course, it's the birth of the NHS, wholesale nationalisation, really the introduction of the welfare state. It looks like we're on the road to socialism. But again, if you look beneath the surface, that government is not as radical as it looks from our viewpoint. First of all, what's interesting is that Attlee government received very little opposition. Particularly, you might expect when there's Labour government, you expect the stock exchange to go down, a huge flight of capital. That doesn't happen. That's because there's an awareness, even amongst the ruling class, that we need nationalisation for reconstruction. There's also been, just like World War I, there's been a large-scale radicalisation. There's actually been British troops mutiny in the Middle East. So there's the same sort of radical move around the country. So even the ruling class believes that, okay, maybe this is an opportunity to give significant power to the Labour Party. Again, what that illustrates is the Labour Party ultimately is British capitalism's B team. Its ultimate purpose is not to push us towards socialism. It's every now and again to provide a sort of safety valve for the system. Now, one of the worst aspects of the Attlee government that's rarely publicised is its foreign policy. Attlee organises crushing left-wing rebellion in Greece. Now that in some ways is the root of the current Greek mess. Also organises crushing popular uprisings in Malaya. Sometimes gets a lot of credit for promoting Indian independence, but again he was forced into that. Originally, very reluctant to grant independence to India, but because there was a sailors' mutiny in India that sort of made it inevitable, really. Also brought Britain into NATO. So actually, now that government fell in 1951. Strangely enough, even though it got a bigger vote than the Tories, of course, because we have this absurd FPTP system. Having the most votes doesn't mean you win. The Tories get back in, despite Labour getting more votes. So it does show about why the government fell is that in 1951 it introduced the first little crack, in the commitment to the NHS. Now, when they introduced prescription charges, there were one of the key figures in the history of Labour left, a guy called Aneurin Bevan, but also Harold Wilson. They resigned in protest. Now, when that government falls, you get 13 years of Tory rule, and again, it's the Labour left, people like Bevan, Wilson, who were able to rebuild the credibility of the party. Now, moving into 1960s, British capitalism, it's sort of like downward slide. By the time you get in 1963, 64, Labour gets back in. Now, again, it's got a leader from the left. One of the themes of Labour is often the leader does come from the left, but it's about what happens to the leader when he's elected. Now, again, there might be a lesson for us here in terms of Corbyn. Leaders frequently come from the left, but they find it difficult stopping the drift to the right. Now the Wilson government, 60s, very similar to Attlee's government of the 1940s. In terms of foreign policy, completely reactionary. Updates Britain's independent nuclear deterrent, what was called Polaris. Backs the Americans completely in Vietnam. There's no opposition to American policy in Vietnam. One of the interesting things that also happens in the sort of middle of 60s is that Wilson has this very interesting conversation with the governor of the Bank of England, a guy called Lord Cromer, and Wilson wants to boost public spending, And this Lord Cromer basically turns up and says, you can't. So in his memoirs, Wilson says, along the lines of, I can't believe it. This governor of the Bank of England is telling me that even though I'm the elected leader, he's ultimately telling me what I can do. And the governor of the Bank of England sort of looks down his nose and says, that's correct. Now again, what that little conversation illustrates, again, something that the Labour Party is never going to confront, is that where is the real power in the society? The real power is in the institutions of the state, including like the Bank of England, including the unelected press barons, like the Zinoviev letter. Also in that government, you get Labour starts to clamp down on the trade unions. In 1968, they released this white paper called "In Place of Strife." Again, that's an early version of Cameron's attempt to clamp down on union activity. Things like restricted picketing, compulsory ballots, etc. Trying to get rid of workplace ballots. So again, what that illustrates is Labour's relationship with the trade unions is never straightforward. The original idea was that Labour Party is a party of the trade unions, but what you frequently find is once you've got an actual Labour government, it comes into conflict with the trade unions because ultimately its agenda is not an agenda of the working class; it's an agenda of capitalism. Now it's partly because of that conflict with the trade unions in the late 60s that government falls. But then Wilson gets back in 74. Now, what we're moving towards is the 80s. Now, we tend to think about the 80s as that's the era of Thatcherism. But actually, if you look at that government in the sort of second half of the 70s, Thatcherism really begins under a Labour government. When you've got James Callaghan as Prime Minister, he's the one who goes to the IMF. They insist on cuts in public spending. He goes along with it. So that Labour government of the late 70s, that's the first British government since World War II to drive down workers' wages. They've always been going up before then. So what you've got in the late 70s is really sort of Thatcherism before Thatcher. So that government falls in 79. Thatcher gets back in. Again, a huge crisis in the Labour Party. Now in the early 80s, the best known figure is Tony Benn and the rise of Bennism. And again, Tony Benn, very, very similar to what's happened with Corbyn, remobilises the Labour Party. A lot of people might remember it. Huge amount of enthusiasm, grassroots activity. Looks like the Labour Party is reclaiming its soul. The downside is that Bennism, as it was known as, was really about the most important thing for a socialist is to organise within the Labour Party. The most important thing is gain control of the Labour Party apparatus. What's happening outside is less important. That was the sort of thinking. So what Bennism failed to understand was that there were significant working class defeats in the sort of 80s. Now Tony Benn narrowly failed becoming Labour deputy leader, by sort of less than 1%. And that led to now the next leader was Neil Kinnock. Now again, Kinnock, you might find it difficult to believe, but he came from the left of the party. So another in the line of leaders from the left who actually act as a clamp on the left. So the previous guy, Michael Foot, also a figure of the left, but actually plays a role once he's in power of containing and curtailing the left. Now it's under Kinnock. Now Kinnock loses 2 elections. However, he starts the shift to Kinnock paves the way for Blair. All the stuff about we need to have a rose instead of the red flag. We need to start dressing in pinstripe suits. We need to drop the cloth caps. All that sort of stuff. So it's really Kinnock who starts the sort of the lurch to the right that Blair's really going to pick up on. And again, notoriously, the miners' strike '84. Kinnock fails to commit the Labour Party to supporting the miners. Just like in 26, they didn't really commit to supporting the miners in 1926. Okay, now I think I'll leave out the modern era. Obviously, there's a lot, I could go on a lot more, but I'll just try and pick out, okay, what the lessons. I think the lessons are that the Labour Party is ultimately a trap for socialists. It quite often it can attract people from the left, but people who've tried to change the Labour Party from the left have always failed. What's happened is that people with a reputation of being on the left always shift to the right. Because now in Bevan, like I said, it's still a great hero of the left. He resigned over prescription charges, but when he was made Shadow Foreign Secretary in the sort of late 50s, he starts to feel the pressure of elections. So he condemns unilateralism. Likewise, Michael Foot, great icon of the left, once his leader, he plays a role in trying to obstruct Tony Benn. Now, of course, what we have to think about is that Corbyn's fate. Someone who, although he's from the left, is going to find it impossible to actually shift the apparatus of the party. The other thing about the Labour Party, in terms of if you look at a long view of it, is that there's this myth of the golden age, but each Labour government is progressively worse than the previous one. So if Miliband had got in, then obviously it would have been preferable to Cameron, but the limits in terms of his commitment to spending, it probably would have had the same fate as Wilson, Callaghan in the 70s. So the Labour Party is ultimately irreformable. It's not a vehicle for socialism, and that's why it's important ultimately that socialists organise outside the Labour Party.
Great.